Shwmae a chroeso I Sgwrs, podlediad Consortiwm Canolbarth y De. Yn y podlediad hwn byddwch chi'n clywed y trafodaethau diweddara am bob math o bethau addysg. Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the Central South Consortium podcast. In this podcast we'll bring you the very latest discussions on all things education.
Hi and welcome to CSC's Literacy Team's first podcast. My name is Catherine Billington-Richards and I'm the lead for LLC and CSC. I'm joined today by Emma Jackson-Phillips and Gordon Bell, and today we're going to be discussing books that have influenced our strategy, thinking and training over the last few years. It's sort of a literacy desert island discs, if you will. It's a bit of a joke that when Emma joined us last January, I actually gave her a reading list and a colour-coded timetable.
I've got to be honest, I think that's when I knew we were going to get on, Kath.
But all joking aside, I think we found it really helpful to have texts that have sort of challenged our thinking, inspired us, but also having an evidence-informed basis for our work. So I'm going to hand over to Emma and ask Emma, what's the first book that you've chosen to talk to us about today?
Well, I don't think this podcast would be much good without talking about the Education Endowment Foundation's Language and Literacy Toolkit. The first thing is that it's free. It's from this established charity. And what I really love here is that it's evidence informed. You get a detailed report, but also you get a summary of the recommendations. So it's created with busy practitioners in mind.
That's good. Can I ask, how do you think a school would use that sort of on a practical level? What advice would you give to a school that wanted to use that text to move forward?
Well, it's really kind of easy to apply and accessible, mainly because it breaks down the research into three different categories using icons. So the first one, you've got how cost effective an intervention will be. So you can work out whether you've got the means and resources to employ it, because there's no point perhaps looking any further if it's going to be something really costly and you don't have the resources. Then with the padlock icon, you can see how secure the evidence is. So the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, acknowledges that not all research is as robust. So what they do is they rate it using these 5 padlock symbols, so you can see how robust and secure it is. And then finally, but most importantly, they also give you how much progress in months the pupils are expected to make, but as a direct result of the intervention.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, it's great. And I'm not sure how many practitioners are actually aware of it and how easy it is to use.
It's definitely, it's a really helpful tool, isn't it? Especially around intervention, because that's something we see schools investing an awful lot of money in. And obviously you want to make sure that what you're investing in, has a robust evidence base. So Gordon, I can see that you want to make a point.
Yeah, I was just going to say there that Emma was talking. You asked Emma about how easy it was to use with schools or for schools, and I've actually done some training using it in terms of looking at a school and looking at what works in literacy, and it's been really, really useful because a lot of what when you do the training, a lot of what works in literacy, sometimes it's based on what people have done themselves, that they just think it works because it works for me. And actually to have something that's like evidence informed, and that you can actually, and as you said, Emma, and say you can look at the robustness of the evidence and say, well, actually, this particular strategy is really heavily evidence informed. There's so much in its favour that we can't ignore it. Yeah. Did you want to say something, Emma?
Yeah, definitely. And it's also kind of confidence inspiring, because whether you're a senior leader, a head of department, a lead for literacy, a classroom teacher, you can go to whoever's in charge of kind of making the decisions fully armed and prepared, with all the facts in terms of how cost effective it is, the evidence behind it, and also the progress that the pupils are expected to make. So I think it really makes practitioners feel a lot more confident in their decision making. And the other thing is that you can also work out the kind of opportunity cost with interventions. So if you've got kind of several different priorities that you're working on in a school, you can pick the intervention that suits your setting the most, and you're kind of fully aware of what the opportunity cost might be if you employ one intervention over something else.
I was going to just add there as well that what would be great with these EEF guidance documents, because you've got the preparing for literacy, which is like talking about early literacy, you've got the Key Stage 1, the Key Stage 2, and going into secondary and Key Stage 3. There's a great bit with the Key Stage 1 guidance. There's this fantastic self-assessment guide as well, which they don't seem to have with the other ones, and which is a real shame. You get like discussion guidelines around it, but you also get this self-assessment guide, which basically looks at, so it takes, for example, one of the recommendations or one of the guidance, which might be something along the lines of that use a balanced and engaging approach to developing reading, and then it'll give you standards or criteria, if you like, about what would that look like if it was ineffective in a school, what would that look like if it's improved in a school, and what would that look like if it's exemplary in a school. So as I say, I've used that really successfully with the school to talk about where are you currently now and how do you get to the next stage.
Definitely. I think we're big fans of the EEF in Central South, aren't we? We use their work an awful lot to sort of inform where we're going and in our sort of day-to-day practical support with schools. So thanks for talking about that one today, Emma. It's a really worthwhile text for schools to get involved with. Gordon, I know you're going to talk now about reading, a text that's inspired you about reading.
Yeah, I am, Kath. I'm going to talk about a book. It's called Reading at Greater Depth in Key Stage 2. It's written by Suzanne Horton, Louise Beattie and Sharon Lanny, published by Sage Publishing, came out in 2019. I don't know where I came across this. I can't remember whether it was a Twitter, one of these, a Twitter recommendation, or one of these, Amazon, where Amazon tells you based on what you bought before, I'm not, sometimes I look at that and think, I'm not quite sure actually if Amazon does know me that well, because I do want to buy those things. And I don't know if, sometimes the algorithms aren't necessarily accurate. I don't know if either of you are on Spotify, for example, but are you on Spotify?
Yeah.
Okay. Spotify will tell you, gives you this thing at the end of the year about what you've listened to and then recommends things to do. And I know last year for me, it said something that I listened to over 150 musical genre, and it put this little playlist together for me, which was rubbish. And I thought, well, the thing is, I only listen to Detective Midnight Runners and indie guitar bands, so I don't know how that could be the case that I would like all these other things. But in this case, Amazon came up trumps.
We should say that other booksellers and music streaming sites are available.
Yeah, they are indeed. Yeah. So this book was really useful for me because a lot of our work is around developing reading, a lot of our focus is on developing reading. What this does is it looks at approaches to developing higher order reading skills, but it also provides support and guidance on best practice in the classroom. It's very, very accessible from a reading point of view for someone like myself, definitely. You've got 11 chapters. None are about more than about 12 pages long, nicely broken down. Each chapter starts with sort of objectives for the chapter. You get a link to teacher standards, and you get a link to program of study, which is the English program of study. But I mean, it's not a massive leap to look at how it would look like from our program of study point of view. And within the chapter, then you get little references to research. It's all based on evidence-informed research. It kind of fits in with what we were talking about with the EEF. You get all these you get the link to research, you get case studies, nice little reflection points to think about what you've read so far, and then at the end of the chapter, a nice little summary of what you've come across. So really, really useful. I mean, I don't know. Do you remember when the professional standards came out? We were told about as teachers to do be research informed, etc.
Yeah.
And I discovered Google Scholar for the first time. I never knew it even existed before that point. So people said, there is this thing called Google Scholar. You could do the research. And when we look at the research, sometimes, I mean, I think you two are probably a bit more intellectual than I am, but I'm not. I sometimes find that research quite difficult to get my head around. Do you remember we were looking at one last term? There's a vocabulary one about how seeing words helps improve your understanding it.
Yeah. But
it's like 50 pages, and instead of talking about writing, it calls it something like orthographic facilitation. You know, it's academics writing for academics. This is very much teachers. I'm assuming the teachers, people writing for teachers.
Which is so important, isn't it? Because at the moment, teachers' time is so precious that you want something that's easy to jump into, don't you?
And you don't want to be kind of feeling around in the dark and trying to work out how to actually apply the research. If somebody's already done that for you, it just makes things so much easier. And I remember you talking about the fact that it was that kind of explicit teaching of reading skills that's really evidence informed that you particularly liked in this book as well, Gordon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of it fits in very nicely with what we are focusing on at the moment, about how do we get that explicit teaching of reading, how do we develop the reading skills. You know, I mean, so many times I'm working with schools, and you know, so many teachers will say, well, they can read, but they don't really understand, they don't really comprehend what they're reading. And then, you know, it's looking at that in a bit more detail. But as I say, it's the way, you know, you've got, like, say, for example, you've got a chapter on questioning. Really, like, yeah, it talks about Bloom's taxonomy, Barrett's taxonomy, but it breaks it down. There's a lovely part in there which looks at the Barrett's taxonomy, you know, the kind of literal comprehension, reorganization in French, etc. And then got little aspects within it and suggestions of question types. So nice and practical that you as a teacher can take away, and you can either read it as a whole text, which obviously I did when I first got it, read it all the way through, but it's also a dip into text as well.
Yeah.
You wanted to refresh yourself about, like I say, questioning or analysing text, there's a lovely chapter you can dip into to read.
That's great.
So would you say that it's most useful for, say, NQTs or experienced practitioners? I'm also thinking about how literacy mediates the curriculum. Would it be suitable for any practitioner to perhaps pick up and dip into this text?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, obviously, I consider myself to be quite an experienced practitioner by this point in my life. But so it gives you, it's that reflection for you, and the thinking about what you're doing. But also, I mean, I don't know about you. I mean, I did a PGCE and then was turfed into school. I remember we had hardly anything in our training. As I say, it might be very different now, teacher training, but we had hardly anything in our training about the teaching of reading. And I, you know, you hoped that you went to a school where you saw it in action very well. And I didn't. My first teaching practice was the classic, the teacher sat at the desk and for half an hour every day called children towards him, and they stood in a line and they waited to read to him, and then they moved on.
Oh my goodness. I don't know whether things had moved on that much by the time I was doing my PGCE, because
Oh yeah, thanks Emma, because I'm so much older than you.
that's not what I meant.
That
That's not what I meant. No, what I was going to say was that we were still kind of being encouraged to do the VAX learning style questionnaires and look at Gardner's multiple intelligence theory and include gimmicky kind of videos just for the sake of it, which didn't progress learning. So I think, yeah, it's really important that we're talking about some text here that could be, you know, fail safes on a PGCE.
Definitely. And I think as well, what I love about what you said there, Gordon, is how much it resonates with other texts that are really influential for us. I mean, I know we're doing a lot of work on Reading Reconsidered and also Thinking Reading at the moment. So it's a text that links really well with those. A question I've got is, obviously, you mentioned that it links to the English curriculum. You know, we've got Curriculum for Wales on the horizon. How would this text be helpful for teachers in Wales when they're looking at planning their reading curriculum moving forward?
I think there's probably a couple of aspects there, Kath. One is around, you talked about it there with the Reading Reconsidered, about how much we are looking at that more in-depth teaching of reading. And I do think that Curriculum for Wales offers this great opportunity for schools to look at their current reading provision and think about what can we do differently. And I definitely think that from a primary point of view, having, you know, when we went to the Reading Reconsidered training and looking at this, they're very much talking about that really deeper critical analysis of text that we don't perhaps do at primary level, I think, at the moment.
Yeah.
To that extent.
Yeah, and I think sort of gone are the days where we pick text purely for engagement, or, you know, what the children are going to enjoy reading. Now it's much more, well, what can they actually gain from this text in terms of the challenge, in terms of the rigor, in terms of being able to kind of embed non-fiction into our lessons and things. So I think the tide is definitely turning in terms of text selection.
Definitely. I know you mentioned something as well about it talks about developing reading resilience. Is that right?
there's I mean it looks at that. I mean that's the other element there in terms of curriculum for Wales. It's that element of schools looking at what their current teaching of reading is and focusing on that and how can they improve that, but also that basic reading provision. There's a great bit when I got it. Hang on, let me find it for it now. You know you're going to like a book because like on page, I think it's page 6. Yeah, page 6 here. It talks about challenging text, and there's this great quote that they used from some research, Shanahan et al. 2012. And the quote, which is great, is just as it's impossible to build muscle without weight or resistance, it's impossible to build robust reading skills without reading challenging texts. Definitely. And that just chimes so much with what we've discussed a lot, isn't it? About how we have to get, and there's actually quite a bit in this book about that perhaps as teachers, we're a little bit limited in terms of the canon of literature that we're providing to children. We're sometimes afraid of offering them a challenge, but without giving them the challenge, just as in the same way there as it's making the point. I can do weightlifting at home, but if I'm only lifting up 1 kilogram weights, I'm never going to build muscle. So you have to give yourself some sort of resistance and challenge, don't you? And then there's really there's some really interesting information here about what makes a challenging text. And it isn't just about, well, it is partly, your Shakespeare's and your Dickens for primary and having that different narrative structure and the language, but also challenging texts are, like the Anthony Brown kind of picture books because of the themes within them.
Yeah, definitely.
That's also like a challenging text for older readers.
It really ties in, doesn't it, with the Lemov work in Reading Reconsidered when it talks about the different ways that text can be challenging. So it's, as you just said, in terms of narrator, but it also can be sort of style or theme or topic that can be challenging as well, can't it?
And it's all about, with the challenge, it's all about, does it offer the children opportunity to dig deeper into it? And the depth may be in terms of language or structure, but it may also be, as you said there, Kath, in terms of making them think about the theme. And how do they respond to that theme?
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think in a way that's quite reassuring as well for teachers to be thinking that it's not just kind of the lexicon that we need to look at in terms of the challenge and the rigor, but it can be the symbolism, it can be even the non-fiction that you embed within a text. There are ways to kind of make a text more challenging in the classroom. And also I do like the fact that that what we're advocating here is the reading of whole texts as well, in terms of developing that muscle and that resilience. So to kind of piggyback onto that, so you talked about explicit teaching of reading at a primary level. I'd like to talk about Making Every English Lesson Count by Andy Tharby. So although this is geared towards secondary practitioners, I don't see why the principles couldn't be applicable at any key stage. So the principles that they mention are challenge, so the idea that the pupil's got to be working outside their comfort zone, the importance of teacher explanation, that it's got to be new knowledge or skills, modelling, so how to apply that new knowledge and skills and the explicit teaching for pupils in how to do that. The deliberate practice, the idea that pupils aren't going to kind of progress their learning without practicing. The questioning, which needs to make the pupils think hard, have the breadth, depth, accuracy, and then finally the feedback. So it's a really simple text. It talks about mainly reading and writing in the English classroom, but it gives you the most effective ways to instruct pupils for maximum literacy progress. And who doesn't want that?
No, exactly. Yeah, who doesn't? Is it? I mean, I don't really necessarily know, Emma, but I'm assuming there are quite a lot of texts around the teaching of English aimed at secondary school teachers. Yeah. What makes this one a bit different then, or stand out for you?
I think for me, it's about how easy it is to pick up and plop into your own classroom. I like the fact that there's no gimmicks. There's no need to deviate. The chapters are really focused on the biggies. So challenging reading, explaining reading, modelling reading, practicing reading, and then you get the same then for writing. And I also like the fact that each chapter starts off with a case study, which is something like a problem that's often faced in the classroom, which is quite reassuring, followed by some of the reasons why this issue occurs. And you've even got, again, thinking about teacher workload, you've even got kind of instructional transcripts of how effective questioning can be used to further the pupil's skills.
So would you say, Emma, it's quite easy to adapt for use in your own classroom then?
I would say so. And also, it doesn't kind of move away from the principles of what good pedagogy is. So even if you're reading it as a non-specialist or a school leader, it's still got those kind of cornerstones of the challenge, the explanation, the modelling, the deliberate practice, the questioning, and the feedback. And I do like how user-friendly and accessible it is for anyone to read.
Sounds brilliant. It sounds really interesting, Emma. I know you've got another text as well that you found really interesting recently as well.
Oh, I know. I'm sorry to kind of hog the recommendations here. But the Research Ed Guide to Literacy, an evidence-informed guide for teachers. I know that we've all read this here, but I can't believe up until recently I hadn't even heard of the Research Ed community, because it is a community. It's not just a series of texts. I hadn't heard of the conferences or the series of guides for teachers, and it's been a really refreshing revelation. Because I feel for many years teachers have been kind of feeling around trying to work out the best bets for their practice using their intuition, and then the research has been quite far removed from the classroom in terms of it being very theoretical and difficult to apply. Well, now we have this community of teachers, school leaders, researchers, policymakers, launched by Research Ed in 2013. And finally, we can kind of marry up the psychology, the cognitive science as part of pedagogy. So it's a really exciting time for education, I feel.
It is. I think the Research Ed movement is a really interesting thing to research if you're not familiar with it. It is definitely, as you said, like that grassroots type organisation, isn't it, Emma? I've been reading a lot around curriculum design at the moment, and the Research Ed Guide to the Curriculum is such an excellent book. If you want to jump in and look at sort of curriculum theory and curriculum design, there's an excellent chapter in there by Christine Council, which looks at curriculum intent and what that would look like in different areas. Again, there's a great section in there on Doug Lemoff on writing a knowledge-rich English curriculum, and a great chapter in there on cultural capital. They're really, like the book that you referenced, Gordon, they're quite short chapters. They're quite easy to dip in and dip out of as well. So it's an easy to pick up and read and put down when you're busy and things like that. So definitely something I'd recommend. Emma, I can see you want to jump in.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting as well that they're meta studies as well. So so you kind of feel secure and safe in the fact that it's evidence informed. The Research Ed Guide to Literacy talks about the biggies, the teaching of reading, myths and evidence, assessment of literacy skills, how to teach writing, how to teach spelling, how to develop vocabulary. And as you said, Kath, it's a 2-hour read. And I wouldn't consider myself a particularly fast reader, but I remember reading it and feeling either reassured by some of the things I was doing in my practice, or it equally importantly made me question some of the things that I had been doing and thinking about, what's the evidence for this? What's the opportunity cost? I don't know how it affected you, Gordon, when you read it.
I'd probably agree with you there that in the same way that you kind of have this reassurance that, oh yeah, that's good because that's what I do, and I thought I was right doing that. It also is always useful, isn't it, to question and actually think, well, actually, maybe I should be doing this, and why do I do this, And again, I think with all the texts we've mentioned here, I think the big things are to take away are they are easy to sort of pick up and get into, and they're also things that you can take away and put into the classroom straight away. Nice, the same with the reading at greater depth in Key Stage 2 of my book, same as yours, Emma, same as you were talking about there. It's really useful to see case studies, teachers talking, or case of a teacher that goes through what they did in their classroom with something that you can actually get, because especially from a teacher point of view, we always want those practical activities, things that we can just go and do, don't we? That's like the nature, I think, of all teachers. We want things to do, but the good thing with all these texts is they're giving you the evidence-informed research behind why it's a good thing to do. That you're not just taking an activity for the sake of an activity, which I think sometimes we can be a little bit guilty of because we want to be doing things.
It's what's resonated with me is that word about challenging your views and challenging how we think. I remember when you started, Emma, I'm sure you won't mind me saying, some of the texts that I recommended that you read were deliberately challenging, weren't they? In terms of how you think and what we feel about education. I mean, one text that really challenged me was David Didow's "What if everything you knew about education was wrong?" I had to stop reading it at bedtime because I wanted to have educational debates with my husband, and he didn't want to have educational debates at bedtime with me. So I had to stop reading it at that time. But it's good to be challenged, isn't it? Because otherwise we create that echo chamber, and actually sometimes we need to think differently. Sorry, Emma, I can see you.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I mean, sometimes it's not always easy to challenge something that we've done in the classroom, because at the end of the day, we're trying to do that to kind of further the pupils' progress and to support them. So sometimes it can be really uncomfortable to kind of strip back some of those reasons why you're doing what you're doing. But at the same time, it is important. And I do agree that these texts are accessible and they're applicable, and that's something that's really, really important, particularly for this time when teachers are struggling everywhere with blended learning. It's important to have that kind of confidence in what you're doing and what you're reading, and know that it's going to support those pupils at the end of the day.
Definitely. So I think that brings us to the end of our first ever podcast episode. We really hope you enjoyed listening and that you feel inspired to dig deeper into some of the books that we've talked about today. I think, needless to say, we could probably talk for a lot longer about books that we find interesting and inspiring. And we'd love to hear what you're reading too. Who knows, you may even like to join us as a guest presenter and talk about a book that's influenced your practice or thinking. Thanks to Gordon and Emma for sharing so openly with us today. And please give us a follow on Twitter at CSC_literacy, where we can continue that conversation.
Diolch am wrando ar y bennod hon o Sgwrs. Cofiwch ein dilyn ar Twitter a Facebook, tanysgrifio ein sianel YouTube, ymuno yn cymunedau ar ein gwefan a darllen ein bwletin ysgolion wythnosol am y newyddion diweddaraf. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sgwrs. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our online communities via our website, and read our weekly school bulletin for the latest news. Hwyl am y tro. Bye for now.